Good evening. Welcome back to the Dusty Feet. Today is August 20th, right? 2026. And tonight we're returning for another one of our Branches on the Vine conversations. This time we're spending some time with Dr. Carmen Imes and her Torah Tuesday series. Links to the episode that we will be discussing. It's in the description below. Because in this episode, she brings up Exodus chapter 28, verses 31 through 35. The blue robe of the high priest. It's pomegranates, it's golden bells, and there's a familiar story that many of us may have heard that's tied to this. You probably know the one that the high priest enters the most holy place with a rope tied around his ankle. The bells on his robe let the priest outside know that he's still alive, and if the bells stop, they pull him back out. It's dramatic, it's memorable, it sounds biblical. There's just one small problem. The Bible never tells the story. And then when we place Exodus 28 beside Leviticus 16, there's more pieces that don't fit. So today, I want to ask harder questions. Like, why do we keep repeating a story after we've discovered that the text does not support it? Why can a familiar story be harder to release than an unfamiliar truth? I know that question is going to end up being much larger than this rope thing we're going to discuss, but this touches on how we listen, how we remember. It touches on how we teach. And it's whether we can let Scripture correct the stories that we actually end up telling about Scripture. So let's spend some time with this passage, see what we uncover with the bells, the rope, and the stories we keep telling. At the Dusty Feet, we believe meaningful conversations grow when people have a welcoming place to share, ask questions, listen to one another. There are 4 ways you can connect with us. 1. Visit TheDustyFeet.com. That's our main home for everything that we create. 2. Find us on Substack, where written and spoken reflections give us room to slow down and connect. Link is in the description below. 3. Join us on Facebook at Dusty Feet Journey for comments and discussion. Or 4, you can email me directly at bob@thedustyfeet.com. Wherever you join us, we ask that the conversation remain healthy, respectful, and safe. So, pull up a chair. There's always room for you at the table. So before we jump in, quick reminder, if you find these conversations useful, please click that subscribe button. But if there's someone else that might enjoy exploring this scripture the way that we do, then that's when you like these and then maybe share the episode. But please also watch Carmen's original Torah Tuesday video. Again, the link will be in the description below because it does give a fuller context for the conversation that we're about to have. And then in that, she shares some wonderful news at the end of it. I'm going to tell it to you anyways. After years of research, writing, teaching, right? She's finally submitted her Exodus commentary to Baker Academic. So the anticipated publication is, I think it's late fall of 2027. But this is a truly remarkable milestone for anybody. And so we, at Dusty Feet, we want to offer Dr. Imes our sincere congratulations. It's a biggie. Okay, now let's get back to Aaron's robe. So Exodus 28, right? It describes garments worn by Israel's high priest. These clothes, they belong to Aaron's calling, right? They identify him as the high priest. This is the high priest that represents the people that he serves, right? The robe, so verses 31 through 35, was blue. The whole robe is blue. And then Carmen explains that this dye came from murex shells, right? That was extremely expensive at that time in the ancient world. So this was not ordinary clothing. The robe carried dignity, it carried responsibility, because Aaron entered sacred service as a representative of the people. I mean, it even mentions the opening around the neck was reinforced so the robe wouldn't tear. Right? Yet, the text doesn't answer every question. We're not told its exact length or clearly whether it had long or short sleeves. That's worth noticing because scripture sometimes gives us just enough to understand the meaning, right? Maybe without answering every point of our curiosity. But when the text leaves a gap, then our imagination is ready to step in. Now, imagination is not automatically a problem. It's not. Art, historical reconstruction that can help us see, visualize, grasp. Yet the text says, and perhaps it looked like this, they're not the same thing. And that difference matters because around the hem of the robe were pomegranates. They're pomegranates made from blue, purple, crimson yarn, right? Between them were these bells of gold, a pomegranate, a bell, all the way around the lower edge. So the pomegranates, they seem to bring fruitfulness into the picture. As Carmen points out, they echo garden imagery, right? The tabernacle colors, the lampstand, the cherubim, the precious metals, the plant imagery. They invite us to remember Eden and remember God's dwelling amongst his people. And then we hear the bells. So Exodus says that their sound would be heard when Aaron entered before Yahweh and when he came out. And then the verse ends with the words, so that he will not die. Naturally, we have questions. Why does the sound matter? Who's hearing it? How is it connected to Aaron's safe service? So the text does not give us a technical explanation, right? It places the bells within the instructions that Aaron must follow. And that leaves room for careful interpretation. But room for interpretation is not permission to then invent a story and then call it scripture. So the rope explanation that it may have grown from this gap, right? Someone heard bells, someone heard so that he will not die, and then someone pictured people listening outside. From there, the story took shape. If the bells stop, Aaron must be dead. And if he's dead, no one can go in. So tie a rope around his ankle, pull him out. Connects the pieces. But it's not what Exodus says. There's no rope. There are no priests listening for proof of life, or there's no emergency plan for pulling a body out from that inner room. And then when we get to Exodus 16, it creates an even larger consideration, right? The high priest entered the most holy place on the Day of Atonement, one day a year, and on that day only. But on that day, he didn't wear the blue robe. He wore the holy linen garments prescribed for that particular service. And because the bells were attached to the blue robe, the bells were not sounding inside the most holy place, so no one could be listening to learn whether he was alive or dead. So the story picture begins to fall apart. Because the holy place and the most holy place, they're not the same space, right? Regular priests entered the holy place. It was part of their normal service. But they didn't wear Aaron's blue robe around with the bells. And the scripture says nothing about ropes tied around their ankles. The story works only if we blur things together, right? The high priest and the regular priests, the holy place and the most holy place, the daily service and the day of atonement, the blue robe and the linen garments. We mishmash them all together. But once those distinctions are restored, then that rope story, it no longer works. This is why context matters. Exodus, it gives us a garment, and Leviticus then gives us the ritual setting. We need both. So, why does a story like this survive? I think one of the reasons is simple, right? Stories are easier to remember than qualifications. They tied a rope around his ankle in case God struck him dead. That creates a scene, right? We can hear the bells. We can imagine the silence. We can feel the tension outside the curtain. So that image, it settles into our memory. And then later, we may remember the story more clearly than what the actual passage has given to us. Yeah? And paintings, films, songs, sermons, children's lessons, they all add details. And then years later, we open the Bible, we read it. We're expecting maybe some of them to be there. Sometimes they are, but sometimes they're not. But because the picture feels familiar, we assume that it must be biblical, right? Familiarity, it starts to sound like authority. You know, because sometimes we say, well, I've heard this all my life, right? But hearing something all our lives, it proves only one thing that has been repeated for a long time for some of us, but it doesn't prove that it's true. That story, it gives us a quick answer, right? Why bells? Why the warning about death? The rope closes the question. But sometimes quick answers, I think they can keep us from seeing the more interesting world of the text. Because Carmen then points us toward a multi-sensory tabernacle, right? There's incense to smell. I've smelt that incense. You won't forget the smell of frankincense and myrrh burning. You'll never forget it. There's textures described, so textures to be felt. There's colored yarn. There's lamp lights to see. There's bells from the high priest robe. The whole person is drawn into attention. Maybe the bells remind Aaron that he's not walking through an ordinary room, that he simply cannot do what he wants to do, that he serves according to the instructions God has given. God's presence gives life, but it's just not casual. Aaron's safety is not secured by an emergency extraction plan. It's connected to faithful attention and obedient service. Yeah. So that's deeper than the rope story. And that's actually rooted in the text. So maybe there's another reason we may hold on to a myth, right? Maybe it was preached well to us, right? So maybe there we had a trusted teacher that used it to speak about God's holiness. And perhaps the larger points in that were true, but a true conclusion, it, it doesn't turn an unsupported illustration into part of that true story. We don't have to defend a mistaken detail in order to preserve everything else that's good that we learned, right? Because we can all repeat inherited claims without checking them. But the question is, what do we do when the mistake becomes visible? Then do we become defensive? Do we say, well, could have happened, as though the possibility of that were evidence? Or can we say, yeah, I was taught that, but I can't find it in scripture. So I'm going to stop presenting it as biblical fact. And I don't think that's weakness. I think that's actually integrity. Because if our goal is to follow the text, then at times correction, it's not defeat. It's just part of the journey, right? So what can we do when we hear this familiar biblical claim? And what can we do? So first, maybe ask. Ask the question, where is it written? I don't want to know, no, not who said it, not how often have you heard it. Where is it written? And does the passage really say what I think it says? Second, read beyond that one verse. Do other parts of Scripture describe the same person, event, place, garment? Are there other places to look at, to see, to read? Because here in Exodus 28, that gives us the bells. But in Leviticus 16, it tells us what the high priest wore inside the most holy place. So we need the wider context, right? We need to know the whole story, or at least as much as Scripture is willing to tell us. Third, let's see if we can separate observation from interpretation. The text says that there were bells on the hem. It's an observation, right? The rope story? The rope story is interpretation. And that our issues probably come up when it conflicts with then the wider context. But I want to be honest. Let's be honest and fair up front, right? Carmen's multi-sensory reading is also interpretation, right? But it grows from details that are actually present throughout the tabernacle instructions. All of them. It doesn't require us to invent an object, a procedure, an emergency scene. When we do not know, can we just say so? Because sometimes just being faithful, it sounds like this. The text doesn't tell us. Those are honest words. Can we live with that? Back to the rope. So, if we release the rope story, have we made the passage less interesting? I don't think so. We still have this costly blue dye. We have a high priest representing this covenant people. We have three colors of pomegranates carrying garden-like fruitfulness right into this sacred space. We have golden bells sounding as the high priest moves in service. We have beauty, color, texture, sound, order, responsibility. We have a God who chooses to dwell amongst his people, and he gives them a way to draw near. None of that needs a rope. In fact, The rope may have distracted us from the world of Torah that was inviting us to enter. I think maybe that's one of the dangers of a good myth, right? It can take up the space where better questions should or could have been asked. Because maybe instead of asking what the bells contributed to the sacred space, we just turned it into, I don't know, a heart monitor. But this story, right, it gives us an answer, but maybe it's answering the wrong question. We need to think about that. I am grateful, eternally grateful to Dr. Carmen Imes for raising this point in this careful walk of hers through Exodus. Because her Torah Tuesday episode does more than just remove this unreliable illustration. Because when it opens this up, it helps us see the robe again, that costly blue, the pomegranates, the golden bells, the sound of faithful service in sacred space. And inside of that, it's the call to pay attention to the presence of God. So please, watch her original video. Support her work. And again, congratulations to Carmen on submitting her Exodus commentary. Those are long years of labor and love. And perhaps maybe we can follow that same posture of careful attention, right? Let's remain curious. Let's ask better questions. Let's hold inherited explanations. Let's hold on to them with some humility. And then at times, let's allow scripture to just tell its own story. And then when the text corrects us, we don't have to defend the myth. We can just release it. And then maybe after that, we can discover that what is actually in the text might actually be richer than the story that we were afraid to let loose. So thanks for walking on this Dusty Feet path with me. And until next time, maybe keep asking questions, keep opening the text, and keep listening for what's actually there. And keep wandering this dusty path. Thanks for being with me tonight. Shalom, shalom.